Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book number 523, and it is titled Life of Benjamin Franklin, and it was written by John W. Gunn. This is part 5, and we left off on page 46, and that's where we begin. Shortly afterward, Franklin was appointed by the governor to take charge of the defense of the northwestern frontier, to raise troops and build forts, a trust which he executed with ability. Regarding this mission, Franklin tells a good story which shows his free sense of humor and a deal of common sense besides. We had our chaplain, a zealous Presbyterian minister, Mr. Beatty, who complained to me that the men did not generally attend his prayers and exhortations. When they enlisted, they were promised, besides pay and provisions, a gill of rum a day, which was punctually served out to them, half in the morning and the other half in the evening. And I observed that they were punctual in intending to receive, upon which I said to Mr. Beatty, "It is perhaps below the dignity of your profession to act as steward of the rum, but if you were to deal it out only just after prayers, you would have them all about you." He liked the thought, undertook the office, and with the help of a few hands to measure out the liquor, executed it to satisfaction, and never were prayers more generally and more punctually attended. So that I thought this method preferable to the punishment inflicted by some military laws for non-attendance on divine service. The aforementioned controversy between the Assembly and the proprietaries finally led to Franklin's dispatch to England in 1757 to remedy the anomalous situation. His historical review, relating the steps of his negotiations in this matter, published in 1759, strengthened his reputation so that Massachusetts, Georgia, and Maryland chose him to represent their interest also in London. In this dispute, the central point of which was that of equity of taxation as between the proprietaries and the people of Pennsylvania. The cause of the people was so ably defended by Franklin that a satisfactory act was at last agreed to, and Franklin received the thanks of the Assembly. This required 3 years of delicate and difficult negotiations, and, having other colonial interests in his hands, he remained in London 2 years longer, returning to America in 1762. In 1764 he was in London again. Trouble with the proprietaries was to the fore again, and he was to urge the king, in behalf of the Assembly, to take the affairs of the colony into his own hands. He was also empowered to deliver the objection of the Pennsylvania Assembly to the proposed measures of taxation against the colonies. By this time, the events that led to the Revolution were in motion, and from now until the Revolution, Franklin was the one important spokesman of the colonies in England. His chief efforts, however, until the very last, were exerted to prevent a separation between England and the colonies. Although convinced of the injustice of the taxation measures, he counseled obedience to the Stamp Act, and he severely criticized the celebrated Boston Tea Party. It was his belief that if the colonies confined themselves to peaceable protest, the Parliament would interfere in time with the tyrannical course of the king and his ministers. At the same time, he labored incessantly to convince the leading men in England that a just and friendly attitude must be adopted toward the colonies. He was denounced in America for a traitor in spirit, if not in deed, and a mob actually menaced his family and property in Philadelphia. While feeling against him ran high, he was fortunately interviewed publicly by Parliament, and his conduct in this juncture was so candid and able, his statement of the colonial cause so clear and convincing, that his reputation was retrieved. Though he was still regarded askance by ardent patriots such as James Otis, Samuel Adams, John Dickinson, Richard Henry Lee, and others. For the sake of candor, it should be explained that self-interest had apparently somewhat to do with Franklin's cautious position, though it should be added in equal fairness that he was by nature moderate and cautious. He was holding office for both the Crown and the colonies, Deputy Postmaster General for the former, and agent for the latter. Naturally, it was greatly to his interest that the relationship be maintained. But the charge of self-interest has stronger ground than the mere fact of his effort to keep the peace, a course which was honorable enough. We can view in a less favorable light the fact that Franklin was actually brought to the suspicious eagerness by the intimation that better honors and enrollments might be given him by the Crown, an offer which could not but imply some hold upon his allegiance. This suggestion came from the Duke of Grafton, and this message, which he tells us, he gave to the Duke's emissary, has a less manly sound than his other utterances. I was extremely sensible to the Duke's goodness, and very thankful for his favorable disposition towards me. That, having lived long in England, and contracted a friendship and affection for many persons here, it could but not be agreeable to me to remain among them some time longer, if not for the rest of my life, and that there was no nobleman to whom I could, from sincere respect for his great abilities and amicable qualities, so cordially attach myself, or to whom I should so willingly be obliged for the provision he mentioned, as to the Duke of Grafton. If his Grace should think I could, in any station where he might place me, be serviceable to him and to the public. This was diplomacy with a vengeance, a servile attitude that accorded ill with Franklin's own excellent maxim, that a plowman on his legs is higher than a gentleman on his knees. We see that this offer entailed Franklin's indefinite and possibly permanent residence in England, and what this implied can be readily conjectured. Franklin called upon Lord North and called several times upon the Duke of Grafton, but the latter was each time engaged. But his running to and fro in this somewhat obsequious manner availed him not, and when this fine prospect fell through, he sang a different tune. I am now grown too old to be ambitious as such a station as that which you say has been mentioned. Repose is more fit for me, and much more suitable to my wishes. There is no danger in such a thing being offered to me, and I am sure I shall never ask it. But even if it were offered, I certainly could not accept it. To act under such instructions as I know must be given with it. These instructions, it can only be remarked, Franklin must have been sufficiently aware of all the while. However, his patriotism, when the break came, was active enough. He himself fell into disfavor with the Crown in the following way. He made complaint to a gentleman of character and distinction of the sending of troops to Boston and other acts of hostility. This gentleman told him that the ministers did not themselves conceive these measures, which had been solicited and obtained by some of the most respectable of the Americans themselves as necessary measures for the welfare of that country. Franklin was reluctant to believe this, and a few days later the gentleman showed him letters from Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson, Secretary Oliver, and others, which convinced him that the charge was true. Franklin obtained permission of this gentleman to publish the letters, believing that by showing the colonists their true enemies were among themselves, it might produce a more reasonable disposition all around. But the ministry caused Franklin to be denounced for this act in publishing the letters, and his post of Deputy Postmaster General was taken from him. He still tried to bring about a friendly understanding between Crown and colonies, and conferred with Lord Chatham to this purpose, and he had also some talk with Lord Howe, but the situation was hopeless. Franklin returned to America, reaching this country on May 5th of 1775, 16 days after the Battle of Lexington. Franklin was entirely estranged from his son, William Franklin, by the Revolution. William Franklin was the governor of New Jersey, and when the father was discharged as deputy postmaster, the son refused his request that he resign the governorship. The son was a thorough Tory, was imprisoned by the Continental Congress, and finally left America to live in England. Father and son met in 1785 in Southampton, a hurried meeting when Franklin was coming from France back to America, but the attempt to bring about their old relations was a failure, and they never afterward met. That's sad. As a diplomat at the corner of France, Franklin rendered distinguished service to the Revolution, and his position as America's ablest diplomat. Her one man of broad and genuine diplomatic caliber, there has not to this day been any to dispute. As one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Franklin is well enough known. Shortly afterward, he was sent with Arthur Lee and Silas Deane to France for the purpose of securing an alliance with that country. The commission was in charge of Franklin. He was already known to French statesmen, and while he was in London prior to the separation, French representatives had cordially cultivated his friendship and discussed with him the state of affairs in America. Pardon me. His influence in Paris was immediate and immense, not only as a diplomat, but even more as a scientist and a man of letters, as a true cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world. Was he welcomed on all sides in France. Social honors were assiduously shown him, and the government, early in the important negotiations of the Revolution, reposed special confidence in him, numerous proposals and agreements being made with him alone, with the understanding that the other commissioners, Arthur Lee and John Adams, who had supplanted Deane, were not to be informed. This extreme preference, a voluntary and significant mark of the high esteem in which Franklin was held, aroused the jealousy of his fellow commissioners, who bitterly assailed him and repeatedly accused him of being more friendly to the French than to American interests. But that these accusations were merely the outgrowth of personal feeling is sufficiently attested by all the records and Thomas Jefferson. In a warm but measured eulogy of Franklin, he explained the whole matter in a sentence. Mutual confidence produces, of course, mutual influence, and this was all which subsisted between Dr. Franklin and the government of France. Diplomatic negotiations do not make exciting reading, and it can be recorded only that Franklin secured every assistance from France to the revolutionary cause, and concluded the adventurous treaty of February 6, 1778, between the two countries. He was also one of the American Peace Commissioners in 1782, and signed the final treaty of peace on November 30th of that year. It was not until 1785 that he returned to America, until after 53 years of public service. Even then his service was not ended, for soon after his return he was elected president of Pennsylvania, and at the age of 82 he sat as a member of the Constitutional Convention, until his death at the age of 84, April 17, 1790. He was vigorous in mind, though suffering severely from extreme ill health, and exhibited a keen interest in public affairs. Chapter 5. Franklin had distinction as a printer, journalist, man of letters, politician, diplomat, philosopher, and scientist. His scientific are on the same high level as his other attainments. He was the valued friend of the leading scientific men of his day, and both theoretically and practically he contributed much to the advance of science. His two notable inventions were the lightning rod and the stove, which bore his name. He was the true disinterested spirit of the man of science, and refused an offer by the governor of Pennsylvania for a patent on his stove, though others profited greatly from it. His feeling about science and its place in the world is exemplified by his notice to the captains of American ships in 1779. requesting them most earnestly not to molest the exploring expedition under Captain James Cook, then at sea and exposed to the chances of war. He urged upon the captains that the purpose of this expedition was truly laudable in itself, as the increase of geographical knowledge facilitates the communication between distant nations and the exchange of useful products and manufactures, and the extension of arts, whereby the common enjoyment of human life are multiplied and augmented, and science of other kinds increased to the benefit of mankind in general. His scientific achievements were recognized by academic degrees from Yale and Harvard, and from the universities of St. Andrews, Edinburgh, and Oxford. Some ingenious contrivances of Franklin's were an harmonica, a musical instrument composed of a set of 37 glass half-spheres placed upon a spindle to be turned by a wheel or pedal; the bifocal spectacles for both far and near sight, which he made for his own use; a mangle for pressing clothes; an artificial arm for getting down books from the high shelves of his library; and a bathing vessel said to be a curiosity. It is copper, in the form of a slipper. He sits in the heel, and his legs go under the vamp. On the instep he has a place to fix his book, and here he sits and enjoys himself. An account of the general progress of his scientific career has been given by Franklin himself in the autobiography. It is brevity, in a brevity and style that cannot be improved. In 1746, being at Boston, I met a Dr. Spence, who was lately arrived from Scotland, and showed me some electric experiments. They were imperfectly performed, as he was not very expert, but, being on a subject quite new to me, they equally surprised and pleased me. Soon after my return to Philadelphia, our library company received from Mr. P. Collinson, Fellow of the Royal Society of London, a present of a glass tube with some account of the use of it in making such experiments. I eagerly seized the opportunity for repeating what I had seen at Boston, and by much practice acquired great readiness in performing those also which we had an account of from England, adding a number of new ones. I say much practice, for my house was continually full, for some time, with people who came to see these new wonders. To divide a little of this encumbrance among my friends, I caused a number of similar tubes to be blown at our glass house, with which they furnished themselves, so that we had at length several performers. Among these, the principal was Mr. Kinnersley, an ingenious neighbor, who, being out of business, I encouraged to undertake showing the experiment for money, and drew up for him 2 lectures, in which the experiments were ranged in such order and accompanied with such explanations in such method, as that the following should assist in comprehending the following. So that the foregoing should assist in comprehending the following. He procured an elegant apparatus for the purpose, in which all the little machines that I had roughly made for myself were nicely formed by instrument makers. His lectures were well attended and gave great satisfaction, and after some time he went through the colonies exhibiting them in every capital town, and picked up some money. In the West India Islands, indeed, it was with difficulty the experiments could be made, from the general moisture of the air. Obliged as we are to Mr. Collinson for his present of the tube, etc., I thought it right he should be informed of our success in using it, and wrote him several letters containing accounts of our experiments. He got them read in the Royal Society, where they were not at first thought worth so much notice as to be printed in their transactions. One paper, which I wrote for Mr. Kinnersley on the someness of lightning with electricity, I sent to Dr. Mitchell, an acquaintance of mine, and one of the members also of that society, who wrote me word that it had been read, but was laughed at by the connoisseurs. The papers, however, being shown to Dr. Fothergill, He thought they were of too much value to be stifled, and advised the printing of them. Mr. Collinson then gave them to Cave for publication in his Gentleman's Magazine, but he chose to print them separately in a pamphlet, and Dr. Fothergill wrote the preface. Cave, it seems, judged rightly for his profit, for by the editions that arrived afterward, they swelled to a quarto volume, which has had 5 editions and cost him nothing for copy money. It was, however, some time before those papers were much taken notice of in England, a copy of them happening to fall into the hands of the Count de Button, a philosopher deservedly of great reputation in France, and indeed all over Europe. He prevailed with Dalabard to translate them into French, and they were printed at Paris. The publication offended the Abbé Nollet, preceptor in national philosophy at the royal family, and an able experimenter, who had formed and published a theory of electricity, which then had the general vogue. He could not at first believe that such a work came from America, and said it must have been fabricated by his enemies at Paris to decry his system. Afterwards, having been assured that there really existed such a person as Franklin at Philadelphia, which he had doubted, he wrote and published a volume of letters, chiefly addressed to me, defending his theory, and denying the verity of my experiments, and of the positions deduced from them. I once proposed answering the Abbé, and actually began the answer, but on consideration that my writings contained a description of experiments which any one might repeat and verify, and if not to be verified could not be defended, or of observations offered as conjectures and not delivered dogmatically, therefore not laying me under any obligation to defend them, and reflecting that a dispute between two persons writing in different languages might be lengthened greatly by mistranslations, and thence misconceptions of one another's meaning, much of one of the Abbé's letters being founded on an error in the translation, I concluded to let my papers shift for themselves, believing it was better to spend what time I could spare from public business in making new experiments than in disputing about those already made. I therefore never answered Mr. Nollet, and the event gave me no cause to repent my silence. For my friend M. Leroy, of the Royal Academy of Sciences, took up my cause and refuted him. My book was translated into the Italian, German, and Latin languages, and the doctrine it contained was by degrees universally adopted by the philosophers of Europe in preference to that of the Abbé, so that he lived to see himself and the last of his sect, except Monsieur B. of Paris, his clave, in immediate discipline. What gave my book the more sudden and general celebrity was the success of one of its proposal experiments made by Monsieur Dalabard and Delors at Marly for drawing lightning from the clouds. This engaged the public attention everywhere. M. Delors, who had an apparatus for experimental philosophy and lectured in that branch of science, undertook to repeat what he called the Philadelphia experiments, and after they were performed before the king and court, all the curious of Paris flocked to see them. I will not swell this narrative for an account of that capital experiment, nor of the infinite pleasures I received in the success of a similar one I made soon after with a kite at Philadelphia, as both are to be found in the histories of electricity. Dr. Wright, an English physician, when at Paris, wrote to a friend who was of the Royal Society an account of the high esteem my experiments were in among the learned abroad, and of their wonder that my writing had been so little noticed in England. The Society, on this, resumed the consideration of the letters that had been read to them, and the celebrated Dr. Watson drew up a summary account of them, and all I had afterwards sent to England on the subject, which he accompanied with some praise of the writer. This summary was then printed in their Transactions, and some members of the Society in London, particularly the very ingenious Mr. Canton, having verified the experiments of procuring lightning from the clouds by a pointed rod, and acquainted them with the success, they soon made me more amends for the slight with which they had before treated me, without my having made any application for that honor. They chose me a member, and voted that I should be excused from the customary payments, which would have amounted to 25 guineas, and ever since have given me their transactions gratis. They also presented me with the gold medal of Sir Godfrey Copley of the year 1753, the delivery of which was accompanied by a very handsome speech of the President, Lord Macclesfield, where I was highly honored. Appendix. A word about the curious history of Franklin's autobiography. He began it merely as a private record of his family, and the narrative is carried to the year 1730. Was in the form of a letter to his son William. This first part was written in England in 1771. Friends urged him to continue the narrative with a view of publication. He added briefly to it while in Passy, and in 1788 he wrote a third part in Philadelphia, bringing it to the year 1757. Until 1867, this was all of the autobiography. Published, but the original manuscript, when discovered in January of that year, was found to contain a few additional pages, written in 1789, the year before Franklin's death. In 1791, the first part of the autobiography was published in France. It is assured that the text was obtained from someone of several copies of the first part that were sent by Franklin to friends in France. In 1793, two different English translations of this part were published in London. In 1817, William Temple Franklin published what purported to be the first complete version of the autobiography as a part of the collected works of his grandfather. It was, however, printed from a copy that had been sent by Franklin to his friend Le Valliard, the mayor of Passy, Passy, P-A-S-S-Y. The original manuscript was lost to the world, its fate a mystery, until 1866, when John Bigelow, on a visit to Paris, set on foot investigations which led to the finding of the manuscript in January 1867, in the possession of an M. de Saint-Remont, together with a collection of Franklin letters and a portrait of Franklin by Duplessis M. D. Saint-Remont was a descendant of M. D. Valliard, and the Franklin materials had been handed down as family relics. Bigelow paid 25,000 francs for the whole collection, and in 1867 brought out the first genuine edition of the autobiography. The edition published by William Temple Franklin revealed, on close comparison, more than 1,200 separate and distinct changes in the text, and the last 8 pages of the manuscript were omitted entirely. Many of these changes, said Bigelow, are mere modernizations of style, such as would measure some of the modifications which English prose had undergone between the days of Goldsmith and Southey. Some Franklin might have approved of. Others he might have tolerated. But it is safe to presume that very many he would have rejected without ceremony. The truth is that William Temple Franklin had emasculated the manuscript by submitting mealy-mouthed phraseology for the good, virile Anglo-Saxon of Franklin. Such is the strange history of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which, says Bigelow, has scarcely any parallel in ancient or modern bibliography, with the possible exception of the writings of Aristotle and the table talk of Martin Luther. And that is the end of Little Blue Book, number 523, Life of Benjamin Franklin, written by John W. Gunn. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you with the next book.